Director of Cold War Studies here and I at Harvard. And this is a seminar that is being broadcast live on YouTube and is also accessible via Zoom. So I will be introducing the guest, and I also want to welcome someone who is going to be a commentator, but instead will be just offering comments, supplementing what I do as the main commentator on the book that's being presented today, which is by Simon Miles, whom I hope everyone can see up here with me. He is an assistant professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. He has just published with Cornell University Press a book that is the topic of today's seminar and looks at the period from 1980 through, or mainly at 1980 through 1985. It is a mercifully brief book, which I hope will entice readers to get a hold of it. It can easily be read in a day, even in a few hours. It is a very readable book as well as being brief. So the seminar today will look at that book, highlighting it, some of the points in it. Simon will present it here for an audience that by and large will not have read it. And so he will summarize some aspects of it that will be familiar to people who have read it, but I deliberately asked him to do that. Then we will open it for questions, including people can submit questions via YouTube. It's on YouTube that you should submit questions, please. So with that, let me turn to Simon.
Thanks very much, Mark. And it's a real pleasure to be here virtually with you in Cambridge to talk about my new book, my first book, Engaging the Evil Empire, Washington, Moscow, and the Beginning of the End of the Cold War, whose extremely red cover, hopefully you can all see on your screens now, which came out with Cornell University Press on the 15th of October of this year, and which is basically an international investigation into the roots of the end of the Cold War. I thought today that I would do three things. First, talk a little bit about the puzzle that this book sets out to solve. And this book was very much motivated by a puzzle for me. Second, I want to talk a little bit actually about the historical methodology which makes it possible and on which I base the claims that I make in this book. And then finally, to preview for you all the three main arguments of the book. So the end of the Cold War from 1985 to 1991 has become a sort of textbook case of old rivals putting aside their differences and ostensibly cooperating. And I use the term textbook case advisedly because in sort of our textbooks, it's omnipresent, right? As the evidence that actually enemies can, if not necessarily become friends, then certainly reduce their enmity through dialogue, engagement, conversation, etc. But I think our understanding of the process of how and why the Cold War ended as it did remains inchoate. It's kind of there and then it goes away. And understanding this matters, I believe, because similar scale transformations of the international system had theretofore been only brought about by great power war. And while the end of the Cold War is not a completely peaceful process, it has nothing on the events which culminated in 1919 or 1945, and thus understanding how we get such a big change with actually so little turbulence in many senses really mattered to me as someone who's interested in diplomatic history. So in the mainstream, I think it's fair to say that we kind of have four main explanations for why the Cold War ends. One would be the triumphalist explanation, That is that Ronald Reagan, rejected the failed, weak strategies of the past and took the fights to the Soviets, right? That Reagan beat the Soviets, that the United States won the Cold War. This is a very common explanation, certainly here in the United States, for what happened, but I argue in the book, not fully satisfactory. The other side of the story could be that it's Gorbachev who transcends the Cold War and sets it on a new cooperative trajectory, which almost inevitably culminates in the ending of the Cold War. Or you could reject this idea that we need to look to leaders, and you could focus instead on so-called people power, right? Looking at concerned scientists, anti-nuclear activists, the environmentalist movement, it's human rights and Helsinki Watch Group elements as being the forces that kind of bridged the Cold War divide and brought down the Iron Curtain. Or you could, and certainly my colleagues here at Stanford in political science would hew to this line by maybe a little bit instinctively. You could look instead at structural forces, right? Not at the agency of leaders, but rather at the changes of the system. The changes in the system which constrained and shaped leaders' actions. Thus, Gorbachev and Reagan, pictured here at their first summit in Geneva in November 1985, weren't the prime movers, they were responders. But none of these four explanations to me was satisfying because, well, they offer us some purchase on why the Cold War ends. They don't, I think it's fair to say, offer us purchase on how it ends, and in particular on the remarkable pace of that transformation. So if 1985 to 1991 is sort of the end of the Cold War in our conventional periodization, the years leading up to it are not obviously leading towards such an event, right? You can start at the beginning of the 1980s with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan signaling the so-called death of détente, along with the Iranian Revolution and many other events, kind of destroying the superpower condominium of the 1970s. But then it's back and almost better than ever just 5 years later in 1985. So those 5 years struck me as really pivotal to understanding these big pendulum shifts. And that rapid rate of change also poses a real puzzle to historians, for which there are four main explanations. So you could focus again on Reagan, right? You could say that, well, Ronald Reagan reverses himself. He shifts from confrontation to cooperation, perhaps motivated by a fear that the Cold War turns hot, and that this explains the big changes of the first half of the 1980s. Or you could reject the idea that Ronald Reagan really had a strategist. You could say had a strategy. You could say that, well, everything was ad hoc in the Reagan administration, and rapid change should come as no surprise if there is no consistent US policy. Or you could, of course, focus on Gorbachev as this kind of black swan in the Soviet system, whose arrival in very early 1985 just changes the whole nature of US-Soviet relations by his very presence at the head of the table in the Kremlin. Or you could reject the idea that détente dies in the first place and focus instead on Europeans who bridged the gap between East and West and kept it alive no matter what the Soviets were doing. So those four explanations also kind of seek to explain this rapid change. But again, I found, as I thought through them, that none of them really adequately explained the beginning of the end of the Cold War and gave the kind of purchase that I was looking for on this major transformation in our world. And that's especially interesting to me because this first half of the 1980s is not sort of a story of progress over time. Right? When I looked at what happened in these intervening years between the so-called end of détente and the sort of beginning of the end of the Cold War with the Geneva summit of 1985, it's not steady progress forward. It's the so-called Second Cold War, right? Allegedly the most dangerous years since the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s. It's the years when NATO is being practically torn apart, above all over the debates and disputes over the stationing of new modernized US intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe, which elicited protests that broke records in all of these European countries, getting soldiers in the street protesting in uniform against the rockets that are going to be based on the facilities, the installations which they guard. These are the years of so-called gerontocracy in the Soviet Union. 3 Soviet leaders die in 5 years, and on average, 1 Politburo member dies every 6 months in the first half of the 1980s. And these are the years, the conventional wisdom has it, in which Reagan is not only is unwilling, right, to cooperate with the Soviet Union. Even if he had wished to, of course, there would have been nobody in the Kremlin to have done so, so goes the story, but Reagan rejects that. He focuses instead on the ideological offensive, on going on the attack and lambasting the Soviets, as opposed to reaching out to them. So I was drawn to this particular half decade because of this real disconnect between how we remember it and indeed how a lot of our histories are written about it, and then what comes after. And it seemed to me that there had to be more to the story if we were to understand the deep roots of this profound international systemic transformation that is the beginning, that is the end of the Cold War. There had to be more to the story. So in seeking to understand both why the Cold War ended as it did and the deep roots of that transformation, I rely on archival evidence from both sides of the Iron Curtain. And though the 1980s are still fairly contemporary history, archival materials are widely accessible, not only in the United States and Russia, where research is really quite smooth to do on this period, but also in the archives of their allies. And so though I've anchored my this work in the documentary record of the 2 superpowers, I take advantage of what I've kind of started calling knowledge networks on both sides of the Cold War divide. And that is the flow of information between allies, whether that's NATO, and here you can see a closed folder from Library and Archives Canada. It is my obligation as a Canadian to include a small amount of Canadian content in any talk I give, and this is me ticking that box, or whether that's in the archives of some of the Eastern European former members of the Warsaw Pact, where contemporary openness, archival openness on the communist era is really part of a political process of coming to terms with the communist past. And I thought I would give you a bit of an idea of what this means in practice by showing you a few examples of what this kind of broad multi-archival research can actually teach us about US and Soviet foreign policy. So our first stop, if you will, is Berlin, the Stasi archives. In Berlin, and this is the record of a meeting between the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, whose name you can see there at the top of the list of participants, and his counterpart, the head of the Stasi, or the Ministry for State Security, Erich Mielke, whose last name there leads the bottom cluster. And I came across this document and was really struck by it because a lot of the conventional narrative, especially in the US history canon, is that Reagan's election in 1980 terrifies the Soviets, right? That this is this hardliner who's coming in, and that Moscow feels themselves very much on the back foot because of this ideological force. And this is a very triumphalist narrative, and it's one which I dispute in my book, in part because of documents like this, which tells a very different story as the two top intelligence officials in their respective countries kind of compare notes on the state of the world. So they believe that Reagan's defense buildup is more a government stimulus package than a commitment to aggression. And in fact, there's some interesting documents from the RNC records, which also casts the defense buildup in very Keynesian terms from the unlikeliest of sources. It's not a commitment to aggression. They argue that they conclude that business interests are driving government policy. And as Andropov puts it, and here I'm quoting him, they are not building factories and mansions only to destroy them. implied there is to destroy them by actually having a war. And this actually tracks with a lot of other assessments that Reagan would be preoccupied with domestic politics, and in particular the turbulent state of the American economy, and thus that the Kremlin would in fact have a lot more room for maneuver, and that this presented an opportunity for the Eastern Bloc to take advantage of a sense of weakness in the White House, and a general sense also that Reagan in the White House will be very, very different to the more ideological Reagan on the campaign trail, and in fact will be easier to work with than Jimmy Carter, who not in this document, but actually in a Czechoslovak ministry, a foreign ministry document, they describe very tellingly as the inscrutable zigzagging Jimmy Carter. So this gives us a little insight into Soviet and Allied thinking about Reagan right at the dawn of the 1980s. And from there, let's move from Berlin to Prague. This is a Czechoslovak military intelligence report on NATO's Autumn Forge exercises in 1983, which can be had in the archives of the security services of the former Czechoslovakia. It's the equivalent to a US national intelligence estimate. Thus, it's more sort of digested intelligence as opposed to being kind of the active flow of cables. This is after a pause. And so, as I said earlier on, the fall of '83 is often thought of as kind of the most dangerous time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. You have in rapid succession the Soviet Air Force shooting down Korean Airlines Flight 7 en route from New York to Seoul, South Korea via Anchorage. You have the US invasion of Grenada. You have the turmoil over the deployment of new US intermediate range nuclear forces. And then the story goes, this culminates in NATO's Able Archer exercise during the first half of November, part of the annual Autumn Forge series of exercises, which are documented here, as you can see on the front cover of this. And without going too deep into the sort of the myth of Able Archer, the Soviet Union allegedly believes that the exercise is cover for a NATO surprise nuclear attack and contemplates a preemptive nuclear first strike of their own. It's a great Cold War story, but it's one which my investigations, particularly in East Bloc archives, have shown is not really the case. This report and others like it show a much more sanguine view. On the part of Czechoslovak intelligence, also East German intelligence is surveilling this very closely. They don't express alarm about the exercise or even its nuclear use aspects. And they go so far as to say that the new nuclear launch rehearsal should be attributed to a Western perception of a more dangerous world or even a desire to use nuclear weapons, but rather a desire by the United States to further subordinate their NATO allies within the strictures of the alliance. So this document and others like it really changed my perception on some key issues, key events in the history of the first half of the 1980s, namely Able Archer. And I cover this not only in the book, but in a freestanding article in the Journal of Cold War Studies. Continuing our march eastward, this is the notebook of Alexander Yakovlev, Mikhail Gorbachev's key foreign policy aide from the November 1985 Geneva summit, which can be had in the state archives of the Russian Federation. And this is the reaction kind of as it happens by a key foreign policy player in the Soviet Union to that first US-Soviet summit in about half a decade as it happens. And reading through the pages, and I should note that his handwriting is mercifully good compared to a lot of other similar documents that I've come across. It shows the importance to the Soviet side of the meeting to kind of break through the rhetoric, right, to humanize one another. But it also foreshadows some stumbling blocks in US-Soviet relations further down the line. In particular, mentions abound to Reagan's strategic defense initiative, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. The fears of what that could mean for Soviet national security, of what that could mean for the Soviet economy if they needed to try to keep up, what that could mean about Reagan, casting doubts on his sincerity. And even though over time the Soviet perception of SDI diminishes, at this point in the mid-1980s, in 1985, it's a major issue in the thinking of key Soviet officials. And then the final little snapshot I wanted to show is the journal of the Soviet General Staff, Military Thought, Военная мысль, in print since 1937, but with predecessor journals going all the way back to 1918, a top secret journal about military doctrine and strategy, is a fascinating insight an opportunity for a historian to disaggregate correlation and causation, right? To not only look at US policy, but also to look at some really candid assessments thereof, especially as it had to do with various aspects of national security as it was seen by some of the top figures in the Soviet military. And this was, it bears mentioning, a really hot commodity in Cold War Washington. It was one of the main products supplied by Oleg Penkovsky when he spied for the West in the 1950s and the 1960s. And he's the source referenced here in this memo from Richard Helms to the Director of Central Intelligence, John McCone, as needing protection on the cover of one excerpt. And this, I'm happy to say, you don't even need to get to Eastern Europe for. This journal is actually freely available through libraries in digitized form, and is an amazing resource to access Soviet thinking during this time. And since I'm doing this with Mark, I thought I would mention that there's an equivalent for the KGB, the Spornik KGB SSSR, which between the Lithuanian and the Ukrainian KGB archives, you can put together a full run of it. And in fact, just in January, Mark and I were both in Kyiv working together with another colleague doing just that. So these four examples, I hope, give some insight into what someone like me, who is primarily a US foreign relations historian, can do with Eastern Bloc materials to give us context into the world in which American grand strategy operated, evolved, but also critically how it was perceived by the other side. And it's based on this type of archival documentation that I challenge some of the conventional narratives in the Western literature in particular about the late Cold War. And it's based on that I make three main interventions in this book. And I want to shift now finally to talking about what those are. So first, in the book, I argue that the key to understanding the puzzle of the Cold War's rapid and unexpected denouement at the end of the 1980s lies in the beginning of that decade. In the span of just 5 years, between 1980 and 1985, the book shows that the Cold War transformed in two fundamental ways. First, from a balance of power perceived, and I emphasize the word perceived, to favor the Soviet Union, to a more realistic perception of one tilted in favor of the United States. So while Reagan is kind of the avatar of American exceptionalism, for better or for worse, in our sort of historical memory, when he comes into office, and indeed while he's campaigning, he and his foreign policy advisors believe that the United States is lagging behind the Soviet Union. The Soviet military buildup, especially nuclear, over the course of the 1970s, threatened US and Western European allies, as did Warsaw Pact conventional forces in Europe. The Eastern Bloc seemed relatively insulated from the economic turmoil of the 1970s by dint of its relative autarky, and certainly at a time when the United States and others were feeling a lot of pain because of skyrocketing oil prices due to the OPEC embargoes. The oil exporting Soviet Union was reaping a lot of hard currency, which was extremely valuable to Moscow. And at the same time, I show that Eastern officials believed that they enjoyed a strategic advantage over the United States and the West during these first years of the 1980s and try to capitalize on it. 5 years later, by the time we get to 1985, perceptions had not only flipped, but also drawn much closer to reality. Then the second big transformation of the Cold War during these 5 years is from a war of words coupled with back-channel discussions to overt superpower dialogue and summitry. Rising US power emboldened Reagan to begin negotiating with the Soviet Union overtly. Soviet decline restricted Gorbachev's choices and compelled him to meet Reagan often more than halfway, deeming that better than the alternative of isolation and vulnerability, not only for the Soviet Union, but also for himself in his political position in the Kremlin. But it also reinforced his pretty revolutionary commitment to a new type of Soviet foreign policy as the 1980s played out, and indeed to cooperation with the United States. So these twin shifts in the perceived balance of power and also in how the superpowers interacted, I argue, constituted the beginning of the end of the Cold War. My second main argument in this book is that US grand strategy shaped both of these processes, and that Ronald Reagan implemented an approach to the Soviet Union with parallel and complementary tracks. So the first is the best known, and that's what Reagan referred to as peace through strength. The defense buildup, the early anti-Soviet rhetoric, ideological rhetoric that we so often associate with the 40th president. Hallmarks of which were, of course, major investments in the military, deficit finance investments in the military, it bears mentioning, including the new MX intercontinental ballistic missile, the new B-1 and B-2 bombers, and the Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missile. This meant not only the ideological efforts, but also trying to rally NATO around not only the deployment of new US nuclear weapons, but also imposing sanctions on the Soviet Union in retaliation for martial law in Poland. That latter effort is ultimately not really successful because US allies have different opinions on what the right response is, but it's probably best known in the kind of the zeitgeist for the Strategic Defense Initiative. An artist rendering thereof is what you're looking at here. This is actually from the pages of Popular Mechanics. And SDI, I argue, reflected Reagan's own views of the danger of nuclear weapons and a desire to see them, if not eliminated, then rendered useless. But it certainly was not always seen that way, either then or now, and without a doubt played to perceptions of Reagan as a sort of nuclear cowboy. But SDI, or as it was better known, Star Wars, colloquially known at the time, leveraged one advantage and put it front and center, which nobody could deny, and that was US technology and industry. As Yakovlev's notes and other documents show, this caused a lot of anxiety in Moscow. And even if the outer space applications, like what you see here, were pretty far-fetched, earning the sci-fi Star Wars moniker, these types of technologies were actually coming online in the US military at the time. And that was something that acutely worried Warsaw Pact defense planners as the US shifted its doctrine from what was called active defense to air-land battle, which was a kind of blitzkrieg type offensive warfare posture for US forces, primarily in Europe, which was all about leveraging technological superiority. But there's more to Reagan, I show in this book, than just the aggression. And this is the Reagan that is less known, but that broader international archival research reveals. So if peace through strength was the proverbial stick, then quiet diplomacy is what Reagan called the corresponding carrot. And in his writing and thinking on this, I think it's very clear that he viewed the two, carrot and stick, as equally essential to his approach to the Soviet Union even before his election. Now, some examples of this are probably known, such as, for example, Reagan's letter here to Leonid Brezhnev after the attempt on his life by John Hinckley on the 30th of March, 1981, when leaving an AFL-CIO meeting, the president's shot outside the Washington Hilton. And so Reagan writes this by hand in his sickbed without staff, and he commits himself to improving U.S.-Soviet relations and cancels the grain embargo on the Soviet Union imposed by the Carter administration in retaliation for the invasion of Afghanistan unilaterally and as a sign of good faith. Less known is how Reagan actually tries to put that pledge into action. So there are a few stories about this which I bring out in the book, but one which I think bears mentioning now is a back channel that he sets up in Berlin between the US ambassador to West Germany, Arthur Burns, and the Soviet ambassador to East Germany, Pyotr Abrasimov, who actually could meet on a regular basis without attracting any notice, because they were, and this was the title, the co-allied military governors of Berlin. Now, usually they talked about air corridors, train traffic, truck traffic, and things like that into West Berlin through East Germany. Burns sits down at their first meeting and says that Ronald Reagan sent him to West Germany to use this as a forum to reduce, manage Cold War tensions. And throughout major episodes like the downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007, they do just that. And this was a pretty amazing discovery for me working in the East German Politburo archives, where the German translations of the Soviet, originally Russian memoranda of conversation can be found. Again, sort of a back door into superpower relations. And then the third big argument of this book is that not only did Reagan have a strategy, and a grand strategy, if you will, when it came to US-Soviet relations, but so too did his Soviet counterparts. Rather than seeing this as just an American story in engaging the evil empire, I try to tell a balanced story of the two sides, and a reminder that Gorbachev doesn't just inherit a blank slate on coming to power in March 1985, even if he himself, and certainly many authors later on, have dismissed the years before him as nothing more than stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, who's pictured here, and Konstantin Chernenko. And that approach had to do with basically echoing Soviet and now Russian military doctrine of using space to buy time. That is to say, giving some grounds in order to create breathing space in order to address the myriad economic, social, and political problems at home. So there are the issues in the economy, which is barely achieving its goals in industrial and military production, and as this photograph of a Lithuanian grocery store, I think, illustrates very poignantly, very much failing to meet consumer demand. There's the growing sense, which really accelerates as early as 1981, that the invasion of Afghanistan was a mistake, and one for which the Soviet Union is going to pay a serious price. And of course, there is a sense on the part of many, including Andropov in particular, that the Soviet project really isn't resonating with Soviet citizens. Andropov's evidence for this, as head of the KGB, is how many young KGB officers are immediately or very quickly defecting to the West as soon as they go on their first posting. Meanwhile, while there's an atmosphere and certainly a memory of the early 1980s of being a kind of war scare, if you will, that's not how the Soviet leadership is talking about it behind the scenes. So, for example, in a meeting with George H.W. Bush, the vice president, and George Shultz, the secretary of state, Andropov very intentionally downplays the public criticisms that the two sides are exchanging. He pledges Moscow's interest in improved bilateral relations. He says that they need to think about US-Soviet relations almost as a two-level game, right? And that there's certain things they need to say for public consumption, and then there's what they say business-like to one another. And this, Andropov says, and I'm quoting Andropov here, would be in the interest not only of our two countries, but in fact of all mankind. And he talks a lot about the sort of responsibilities of being a nuclear weapon state. Meanwhile, the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe is changing. East German outreach to China, for example, led by Erich Honecker, pictured here with a very unenthusiastic Mikhail Gorbachev, is ginning up economic opportunities for Berlin, but is certainly not something that Moscow is happy to see. Meanwhile, Romanian leader Nicolae Ceausescu has basically stopped taking foreign policy direction at all. And the Warsaw Pact, to which all of them belong, is by 1983 acknowledging that they have no means of repelling NATO short of a strategic nuclear war. That's at a December 1983 Warsaw Pact Defense Ministers meeting. They have such a qualitative deficit that even their significant quantitative superiority in the European theater is not up to snuff. And that's what leads to the major reforms under Marshal Agarkov, which begin around that. And though they don't believe that they can compete in many ways, this never entails abandoning the Cold War rivalry. Right? In the book, I try to show that Soviet leaders are hoping to strike a balance between cooperation and confrontation in order to redress the power imbalance between the superpowers and compete more effectively. So let me just leave you with 4 points by way of summation. And this is the core of what's in the book. First, the perceived shift of power in its favor emboldened the Reagan administration to engage the Soviet Union openly. Second, ending the Cold War was an international conversation in which US and Soviet voices may have been the loudest, but certainly weren't the only ones. Third, understanding the end of the Cold War requires us to look to this earlier period, the first half of the 1980s, and to move past triumphalist narratives. And fourth, that during this process, Reagan's dual-track approach to the Soviet Union, with both carrot and stick, the proportion used thereof reflected the perceived balance of power. And a stronger United States was more willing to use diplomacy rather than coercion. And it's that I argue in the book, which made summits such as this one in December 1987, where Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, possible. With that, thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to talking about the book more.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Simon. So let me emphasize, I am going to step in as commentator. My colleague, Fred Logeval, who is taking part, but he had a conflicting appointment, so he has come in without adequate time to prepare a full commentary, but has given me some excellent questions to raise, as have a couple of others from the audience. So I will leave ample time to come back to those questions. Let me, though, offer a commentary myself on the book. The book, as I mentioned, is a mercifully concise book, which is commendable in the sense that it really gives people something they can read in a day, or even in a few hours, and get something out of, take away from, and to argue with. So the portion of the book that I had already seen before I read the whole book is the portion dealing with the Andropov period, and in particular some of the questions about the events in the fall of 1983. As Simon is well aware, on those issues, I fully agree with what he has done, and have written about those myself. And so I am not going to deal with that. If someone wants to come back to those issues, I will be glad to raise questions with Simon about them. But I'm going to look instead on a few points that I want to take issue with, and then also to talk about some things that aren't in the book, particularly China, which I was surprised gets only a very brief mention toward the end about economic reforms underway there. But I was surprised that it didn't receive more discussion. So let me then begin. Simon rightly points out that the Carter administration in its last 14 months or so, even perhaps a little before that, year and a half, let's call it, but particularly the last 14 months, really began pursuing policies that then Reagan basically continued. It wasn't a sharp break between the two administrations in the way it is sometimes understood. And Simon rightly points this out, that some of this had to do with pressure from Congress, that the Carter administration was being pushed to increase military spending, and the debate wasn't about whether to do it. It was about whether to increase spending by 3% a year, or 5% a year, or 10% a year. So it was a discussion that took for granted that military spending was going to be increasing. And in fact, the budgets, the final two budgets proposed by Harold Brown, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, took full account of this. So in the final year of the Carter administration, in particular, in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it was a much harder line taken toward the Soviet Union than there had been in the first couple of years of the Carter administration. Although even then, and again, Simon points this out, the Carter administration had been emphasizing human rights issues in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet bloc as a whole. So in that respect, by the time Reagan took office in January 1981, there was already considerable basis laid for what he then did. So something, though, that Simon doesn't point out, and again, I think is crucial to understand some of what Reagan was able to do, is to look at the role of Congress. That in the period from 1955 to 1995, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. In other words, 40 consecutive years, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. They also controlled the Senate for 34 of those 40 years. So in other words, they controlled both houses of Congress for the large majority of the period from 1955 to 1995. There were, however, 6 years when the Senate was under Republican control, which just happens to be the first 6 years of the Reagan administration. And so that meant that, unlike what Reagan might have been able to do had he been in office under previous Republican administrations, Ford, Nixon, Eisenhower in the final 4 years, that he had at least one House of the Congress, that is the Senate, the upper house, that was under Republican control. So that gave him greater leverage than he otherwise would have had before. It didn't give him complete leverage because he still had the House under Democratic control, but still it did give him greater leverage. What's interesting, though, is that by the end of Reagan's first term, 1984 in particular, but even beginning in 1983, there was already pressure from Congress to begin to curtail the military buildup that had been underway starting in the Carter administration and then accelerating under Reagan. So even with the leverage that Reagan had, there were pressures on him to begin curtailing some of that. And that, I think, has to be understood as well, that domestic context, the policy-making context, but more generally, the political context in which Reagan was operating. He certainly didn't have a free hand. Not that Simon suggests he does, but I would give more emphasis to that political context. So then let me say a word about another aspect of this that is not brought out, I think, in the book. And then I'll come to a couple of issues with which I would take issue. First of all, Simon emphasizes that in the period 1980. You can go back a little before if you wish, but certainly in the period 1980, he argues that the perception in both Moscow and Washington was that the Soviet Union was on the ascendant, and that the United States was, that there was a much more pessimistic view of where the United States was going. That, however, is nothing new to the US-Soviet relationship. You can go back to the beginning of the Cold War and you will find very similar periods. For example, in 1949, 1950, in the aftermath of the communist victory in China in 1949, and what is perceived as a Soviet military advantage, even though in the wake of the Soviet Union's first detonation of its first nuclear weapon in August 1949, that by the time NSC 68 comes out in early 1950, it presents this ominous view of where the US-Soviet relationship is going. It really doesn't have much connection to the actual standing between the two countries at the time, but it reflects this generally pessimistic mood, and then that is taken still further with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. Or you can go ahead 10 years to the presidential campaign in 1960, and far from seeing the United States as having the advantage, the then presidential candidate John F. Kennedy is presenting it that communism is on the ascendance and that there is a missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that he has to rectify what are these adverse trends from the US-Soviet perspective. Or you can go ahead 10 years to the late 60s and 1970s, say, where the wake of the increasing morass in Vietnam and the steps that were taken internally, the various trends internally in the United States, especially the violent protests against the Vietnam War, the general upheaval in the United States, assassinations of political leaders, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and the rise of domestic terrorist groups, the Weather Underground, and so forth. There was this sense that the United States was in a very adverse position, whereas the Soviet Union seemed to be on the ascendance under its new leader, Leonid Brezhnev, and having quelled a reform movement in Czechoslovakia in 1968, had restored order to the Soviet bloc and seemed to have consolidated its position. And it was in this context that Henry Kissinger made the remark that he saw his task as managing the transition as first National Security Advisor, and then for a while as both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, and then ending as just Secretary of State, that he saw his task as managing the transition to Soviet hegemony, or referred to the United States, as Nixon and Kissinger did, as a weak, pitiful giant. If it couldn't somehow exit Vietnam honorably. And that was a stance that was hard to sustain after April 1975, when the United States made a humiliating retreat from its embassy in Saigon and brought an end to its involvement in Vietnam. So there were many, many occasions when there was this sense that the Soviet Union was on the ascendance and the United States was on the verge of losing the Cold War, certainly having a very difficult time of keeping up. And that makes me, one question I would ask Simon is, why does he start with 1980? Why not go back to the beginning of the Cold War if you see the end of the Cold War as having stemmed from that perception? Because you can find that perception over and over and over. Second thing I would say about that is the Simon's book also argues that that perception changed fundamentally by 1985, so that you could already from that year look ahead and think that there was a pretty good prospect the Cold War would end peacefully and the United States would achieve its objectives. Simon was born after 1985, I think in 1988, and didn't live through that era. I'm 25 years older than he is, and I can tell you that was not the view of anyone who was around in 1985. That's you could look ahead and see the end of the Cold War coming, especially that it would all occur peacefully and the United States would end up winning. That I think is a distortion that is hard to overstate. Beyond that, there is the reality that in the latter half of the 1980s, far from seeing the United States as being on the ascendant, then that was the time when their so-called rise of declinism, with the publication of various books. It had begun as early as 1982 with Munzer Olson's The Rise and Decline of Nations, which pointed to the role of interest groups in public policy making and how they inhibited an effective response to challenges internally. And Olson predicted that that would lead to steady decline in the United States. That was picked up on by a historian, Olson being an economist. That was picked up on by the historian Paul Kennedy in 1987 with the publication of his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, which, even though it looked historically at the rise and fall of great powers, the final chapter of it saw the same coming with the United States. And the rise of declinism was a prevalent trend in the late 1980s, and opinion polls taken by the Gallup organization in 1989 showed that more than half of the public believed the United States was in decline. Only 20% believe that the United States was the top economic power in the world, even though it clearly was by a very large margin. Only 20% of people believed it was. They thought more than twice that amount, 43%, thought that Japan was the top economic power in the world. Similarly, there was that only 18% thought that the United States was stronger militarily. This was in 1989. Thought the United States was stronger militarily than the Soviet Union. You can go back and look at publication of other books as well. Robert Gilpin, for example, this is a little bit earlier. This is 1981, but again, it reflects, this is his book, War and Change in World Politics, but it reflects the same notion that Paul Kennedy brought out, that the Soviet Union was, not so much Kennedy with the Soviet Union, but Gilpin brought out that the Soviet Union was the rising power and the United States was in decline. And he saw that as a trend that wasn't going to be reversed. So to the extent that Simon attaches as much importance as he did to these changes in perception, I would say he better go back and look at what the actual perceptions were in both 1980, but particularly in 1985. I think he would find a much more pessimistic outlook than he alleges. Let me also finally, and then I will come to the questions that others have raised, is to say a couple about things that I would take issue with about some more specific points, but they do play important roles in the book. One of these would be the question of Poland in 1981, where Simon relies, it seems almost entirely, on a flawed book by Matthew May, and he suggests that Soviet Union never would have invaded Poland during that time. The United States misjudged the situation, and that the Soviet Union was willing to let Poland fall under the control of the independent mass movement, Solidarność, that had taken root in Poland in the summer of 1980, and that remained or became an alternative center of power in Poland through the time that martial law was imposed on the evening of 12th and 13th of December 1981. So that Matthew May makes that argument. The evidence, however, does not bear that out. That the first action the Soviet Politburo took in August 1980, when confronted by the rise of Solidarność, was to mobilize 20 Soviet divisions, quote, in case military assistance is provided to Poland. And over the next several months, they pressured Polish leaders, Stanisław Kania and Wojciech Jaruzelski, defense minister at that time, to impose martial law and offered to send Soviet troops in to help with the imposition of martial law. Now, that wouldn't have been the same as the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, but it certainly does not suggest to me that restraint was on the minds of Soviet leaders at that time. Now, the situation changed over the summer of 1981, but that didn't really represent any change from earlier Soviet policies during crises in the Eastern Bloc. That in 1968, for example, Brezhnev spent months and months trying to get the Czechoslovak leader Alexander Dubček and others around him to crack down internally to bring an end, or at least to rein in the Prague Spring. And it was only when finally in August 1968, after phone calls with Dubček, that Brezhnev lost any hope that Dubček would do that, that that final approval was given for a Soviet invasion. And similarly, in 1980 and 81, Soviet leaders continually pressured Kania and Jaruzelski to impose martial law. Now, in the Soviet KGB and the Soviet military were deeply involved in the drawing up of plans for the imposition of martial law. And so they were confident, certainly by the spring of 1981, that martial law would work. They had drafted directly many of those plans in conjunction with the Polish Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Polish Defense Ministry. So the only question was to get the Polish leaders to clamp down. They orchestrated or at least helped bring about the removal of Kania, in whom they had lost confidence, and transfer of power to Jaruzelski, exclusive power to Jaruzelski in the fall of 1981. And from then on, it was only a question of pressuring Jaruzelski to impose martial law. So by the time martial law actually was imposed, Soviet leaders were highly confident it would work, and they didn't see any need to offer a military guarantee any longer to Jaruzelski. And so they didn't want him to think he actually still had one, because then maybe he wouldn't impose martial law forcefully enough. That is the only reason that that issue arose. It had nothing to do with whether Soviet leaders were willing to see Solidarność take control of Poland. That comment that Simon Seiss in his book was purely a comment they presented to Jaruzelski during phone calls on the 10th of December between Mikhail Suslov and Jaruzelski, and then between Brezhnev and Jaruzelski. Has nothing to do with actual Soviet sentiments. That they were just rehearsing that for the way they would present it to Jaruzelski. It had somehow martial law gone wrong and Solidarność provoked a civil war in Poland, or violence erupted, or some other turmoil, chaotic turmoil erupted, then Soviet leaders would have had to decide whether to crack down with their own military forces. But they were confident that martial law would work, and so they didn't even want to deal with that situation unless they were absolutely forced to. Let me finally just comment quickly on 1985 with Gorbachev, because here Simon accepts some of, even though he rightly dismisses quite a bit of the Gorbachev propaganda about the Brezhnev period, depicting it simply as a matter of stagnation, zastoy in Russian, which Simon rightly points out that Gorbachev used that to justify the changes he was making. At the same time, Simon seems to accept some of it, particularly in his presentation of the Soviet economy, which he refers to as declining. The Soviet economy did not decline in the first half of the 1980s. The rate of growth was slower, but there was never a year in which it actually declined. The declines in the Soviet economy began only at the end of the 1980s, when after Gorbachev did an incompetent job with economic reform, and so it caused upheaval and instability in the Soviet economy that did bring about a genuine economic crisis. But the notion that there was a true economic crisis in 1985, I think, again, is just misguided. There was certainly not highly effective growth by any means, and Soviet leaders were dissatisfied with it, but there wasn't the kind of catastrophic crisis that Gorbachev and Shevardnadze and Yakovlev later depicted. Similarly, Simon accepts Gorbachev's account in his memoirs that in March 1985, he told the East European leaders that, they were going to be on their own. Certainly no East European leaders actually believe that, so that would lead you to think, did Gorbachev actually say this to them? And if you look at the notes from the discussions he had with Honecker, with Husak, with Jaruzelski, and with Todor Zhivkov at that time, show nothing of the sort. He told them that they were going to have to do much more on their own economically. He never said to them, I will not send troops into your countries if you face internal turmoil. And that's why in 1989, no East European leader, certainly not Honecker, thought they were going to be left on their own if the kind of instability broke out that did in Eastern Europe. So in those respects, I think it is important to look more carefully at what was actually said. Final point will be, I mentioned that Simon leaves out the role of China. I was surprised at this because it seemed to me to reflect so clearly an issue on which the Reagan administration actually did try to take advantage of a weakness of the Soviet Union, which was that it was still bitterly at odds with China. Now, the Carter administration had begun this in 1979, beginning the sharing of intelligence with China, and then fully normalizing relations with China in the fall of 1979. That continued through and accelerated in 1980 after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when China became one of the suppliers to the anti-Soviet guerrillas in Afghanistan, and was working in conjunction with the United States in that regard. But more importantly, the Reagan administration then escalated it still further and began selling weapons to China, and that continued all through the 1980s until June 1989, when that relationship was broken off in connection with the brutal crackdown in Beijing by the Chinese communists against unarmed protesters. But throughout the 1980s, the Reagan administration was bringing pressure to bear on the Soviet Union by exploiting this the rift that the Soviet Union had with China. And you can begin to see that the Soviet Union responding to this in 1982, when Brezhnev begins to try to tamp down the confrontation, the conflict between the Soviet Union and China, and that continues then under Gorbachev, where he too tries to repair the relationship. But because that seems to me to fit into some of what Simon is arguing, I was surprised that China really plays no role in the book. All right, let me, I will let Simon comment on some of that, but before I do, I also want to raise a few of the questions that have come in. One of them, Simon does discuss the Carter administration's emphasis on human rights, and but also to pick this up with under the Reagan administration. How would you assess that issue, and particularly Gorbachev's seeming willingness, even early on, to try to look at it a different way? He clearly had very little, he had a quite negative view of dissidents in the Soviet Union, but there were some other issues on which he could try to move ahead. And so, but going back even earlier, in June 1983, I think it was, the Reagan administration had brought up something that had already been underway for 5 years, going back to the Carter administration, that there was a group of Pentecostals in Soviet Union, in Siberia, who had been pressing to be allowed to emigrate because they felt they weren't able to exercise their faith in the Soviet Union. And so to try to pressure their way out, they took refuge in the US Embassy in Moscow, and were there from, I think it was for roughly 5 years, from mid-1978 until finally they were allowed to leave in June 1978. How would you assess, Simon, the impact of that in Reagan's thinking? Not maybe that specific incident, but more generally, that there was this effort being made even before Gorbachev. This was under Andropov, who was certainly not a humanitarian, but nonetheless to try to address some of the US concerns about that. I also have Fred, again, my colleague Fred Logaval raised a very good point. You went over some of the sources you have used in the book, the many declassified items in various countries, Western countries, as well as former Soviet bloc countries. What, however, would be some of the documents that you would like to see that scholars still do not have access to? What in particular would it be? Certainly, I can think of some. A lot of the Soviet Politburo records are not available. Some have been released, but a great deal of others haven't been. Presumably some intelligence records, other such things. So what in particular would you still like to see that hasn't yet been released? And let me ask finally, with regard to thinking about the importance of Gorbachev, you almost imply that it wouldn't have mattered if, say, Viktor Grishin had emerged victorious in the succession struggle in 1985, that it's still, because perceptions had changed so much, again, according to your argument, that that perceptions had changed so much that things still would have worked out, maybe not in the same rapid fashion they did, but would have eventually worked out as they did. So that would be an argument that the Soviet Union was so much on its heel, which is, perilously close to the argument you make that Gorbachev was important, but it wouldn't have mattered that much if Grishin or some other, Grigory Romanov or Grecian was the most plausible, and very nearly did outflank Gorbachev. But so that seems to me highly implausible. That is, I do see Gorbachev as having been fundamentally important in the end of the Cold War, even though the Gorbachev who came into office in March 1985 was not the Gorbachev of, say, 1988, much less 1989. So I just don't see that Viktor Grecian, if he had come to power in 1985, he lived until the mid 1990s. And if he had been around in, say, 1988 or 89, there would have been any of the events that occurred then. You seem to imply, however, that that would have happened. All right, let me, there are a couple more questions, but we've given you quite a few things to address. So let me turn back to you, Simon.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for the questions. I'm going to try to cluster them and won't have, out of a desire to give others a chance to pose theirs, I won't necessarily give the exhaustive versions of the answers to these, but let me just kind of start them up. I want to answer the two questions that Mark posed about starting in 1980, as well as the role of China in the book. Together, because to a certain extent, my answer to those questions has a lot to do with Mark's first point about the length of the book. And that is to say that those are really great points. And a history of perceived U.S. decline would be a really, really good book. It wouldn't be this book. And a history of U.S.-Chinese relations during the Reagan administration would also be a great book. And it wouldn't be this book. I think in both cases, I discussed, for example, the missile gap and kind of link that, as well as the malaise and the sense of almost downtroddenness in the 1970s, which is prevailing in the United States. But part of my argument is about new leaders, in particular in the Soviet Union, in particular Gorbachev. But I'll get back to that in a little bit. Certainly, that's part of the story. But I think a compelling case can and hopefully is made for why we can pick up the story in 1980, while also acknowledging that this is not an entirely new phenomenon. Similarly, while I think in the first chapter, I do lay out some of what the Reagan administration is doing with China at this time as part of its leverage, in part leveraging the skill set of George H.W. Bush, who had been the U.S. de facto ambassador to the PRC earlier. That's certainly an area of a fruitful area of further research that someone could do, but which I felt as I thought about this book, kind of in terms of what I wanted it to look like as a final product, I felt I should mention, and then someone else will pick up on those threads and tease them out, because there's certainly a rich seam there of work to be done. I want to talk a little bit about Poland. I wouldn't say that I agree with your characterization that I rely exclusively on Matthew Ume's book, in that I think you'll find in there that there's some Polish Communist Party Politburo meeting records, as well as some Soviet documentation and some other sources. And without wanting to kind of go through the whole thing in the interest of time, I think you and I agree a lot more than perhaps I detected from your comments, Mark. In particular, I would point to Andropov's comment about the sense that it wasn't worth going to such drastic measures in order to insert the Soviet Union in Poland. And then let me turn to the question of Gorbachev. And I'll take your question, Mark, as well as the last question that was posed about, a hypothetical Grecian or Romanov led Soviet Union. So certainly in terms of actual numerical mathematical growth rates, the Soviet Union is not in the negative, but the rate of growth is and the performance of the economy, I think could give no one a great deal of confidence. Could the Soviet Union have continued along sort of more or less as it were? I think that's true. I think that there are bigger trends in the world which do going on, kind of the rise of so-called neoliberalism, globalization, et cetera, Those are big structural global trends which do not favor an economy that is set up like the Soviet Union's, both in terms of internal management and how it can and can't interface with the global market. But it certainly is fair to say that in a Grecian or a Romanov hypothetical Politburo, you could see a kind of plodding along, and thus that Gorbachev does matter for what he introduces into the system in terms of he and the people around him. I should emphasize introduces in the system in terms of economic thinking. And so, while indeed the economy is not as bad as Gorbachev does indeed make it out to be later on, I think it was clear not only to Gorbachev, but also, for example, to Andropov, that real change needed to happen. And Gorbachev initially kind of echoes the Andropov model for how to affect that, and then he kind of goes out on his own. So I certainly don't make the case in this book that there's an inevitability, that what happens in kind of in 75, in 85, what's happening in 85, the events with which I conclude the book, are not highly contingent. And in the epilogue of the book, I try to kind of walk through some of the later steps that flow from that. But rather in this book, I'm interested in some big trends. And those have to do with perception. And incidentally, to your point on public opinion, while that's certainly important, there's also the perception of American policymakers. Right, and those numbers that you were discussing there, Mark, I don't think carry over to the people who are making a lot of the decisions. If we look, for example, at the recently released book by Philip Zelikow and Condoleezza Rice, kind of the second version of their book on German unification, the view in the Bush administration, for example, doesn't really track with what is going on in some sectors of public opinion, and thus, that's a tough one to parse out. But I do think that there's a meaningful difference, which is fairly dispositive for U.S. policy, and so. The same being true in the Soviet Union, that Gorbachev matters absolutely, in that, for example, he does the opposite of Reagan. Right? When Reagan perceives weakness, he moves away from diplomacy and towards more aggressive types of engagement. Right? When Gorbachev perceives the same thing happening, the same state of affairs in his country, he breaks the opposite way. And this is a really interesting way to get at the perennial kind of maybe more social science, but also historian question of structure versus agency, which is that here we have two different individuals responding to similar perceived structural forces in very different ways. And I think that makes intuitive sense to all of us from our lives. Let me turn now to the question of human rights, which, could also be another, and many scholars have written another rich book, and is certainly a thread running through this one, but it would be fair to say is not the predominant one. The issue, for example, of the Pentecostals who had taken refuge in the U.S. embassy in Moscow really illustrated for Reagan both the promises and the perils, in a sense, of the situation that he had inherited. So on the one hand, Reagan is very open about how he sees Soviet policy towards this specific group, and also groups like them throughout the country, as being, just brutal and nasty and kind of inhumane, et cetera, et cetera. And the Reagan diary is kind of rife with comments to that effect. But it also shows him, when he and the representatives of Yuri Andropov's Kremlin, that they can do business. they can negotiate, that they can make a deal, and that quiet diplomacy, as he calls it, works. And that's Reagan's own conclusion after this episode in particular. So he sees human rights as an area on which he wants to make progress, an area on which he can make progress with the Soviets, but certainly Gorbachev, especially the Gorbachev of 1985, who's meaningfully different from the Gorbachev of the late 1980s and or very early 1990s, is quite frustrated by the US's use of human rights as a cudgel. But it is nevertheless, to varying degrees, a pretty effective, not only cudgel, but also tool to solve problems, but also to build a degree of trust in the relationship, which is a big part of what happens over the course of the decade. And then I'll follow up. Finally, I'll talk about speak to Fred's great question about what I'd like to see. And this one, we could go for hours and hours to talk through everything that I'd love to see. I think some of the most important elements include more records out of the KGB on not only their thinking about the United States and NATO, but also about the situation within the Soviet-led bloc, the Warsaw Pact. There are, for example, some little bits. There's one anthology about 1968 that comes out of KGB archives, and there's bits and pieces here and there, but that's a big gap, and I struggle to imagine that we will be seeing a lot of that anytime very soon. And then the other element that I would love to see, though I should say that the Eastern Bloc intelligence archives are commendably transparent. They're not a perfect one-for-one substitute, but they give us some purchase on some of these ideas, especially through documents like the Andropov-Mielke meeting that I showed you earlier on, where we do get that direct kind of more direct KGB perspective on the world. And then the other one would be the transcripts of Politburo meetings. Some you can start getting into sort of, I guess we could call them summaries or protocols or what have you, but that are not the sort of more stenographic type verbatim transcripts. And so we have to fill in the blanks in some of this. I should say, I should emphasize that really archival materials are opening at a pretty striking pace in Russia, and so I'm a little more optimistic on some of these items than I am the security service items. But Argani, in its new home now, the Russian Archive of Contemporary History, is releasing these types of materials, and so I do hold out hope to actually be able to get at those. But the ones where you have the really sort of raw conversation that's happening at the highest level, as opposed to the neat packaging thereof. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't just wrap up by saying that these are challenges in Russia, but these are also acute challenges in the United States, right? And that none of what I'm saying should be interpreted to mean that, by contrast, go to the Reagan Library and it's all open. That is certainly not the case, and there's a lot of declassification that needs to happen there too, though it's easier to fill in those gaps. But I'll stop there, because I know, Mark, you said that there's other folks with questions, and I want to give them a chance.
Thank you, Simon. I would certainly endorse about the full transcripts of Soviet Politburo meetings. Transcripts of some of the Secretariat meetings are now accessible, but the Politburo transcripts are all still in the Presidential Archive, which is inaccessible. There have been continual efforts by the Rigani, the Russian State Archive of Recent History, to obtain those transcripts, and then they would go about declassifying them. But so far that hasn't happened. However, I share your optimism that it will happen at some point. Enough has improved in the Russian archival situation that I'm much more optimistic than, say, I was 20 years ago. That's the irony, is that despite despite Putin's authoritarian clampdown in Russia, that the archival situation has actually improved. It is better now than at any, or will be after Russia becomes accessible again, because the pandemic has thrown things out of kilter. But the archival situation is better now than it ever was in the 1990s. So okay, let me another issue that you discuss in the book, Simon, it has to do with some of the lower level discussions, including some of the unofficial discussions that were going on in the early 80s, and to look also at some of the covert, or I wouldn't quite call them covert, but at least unofficial or non-public, between US officials and Soviet officials, but also between private US citizens and sometimes Soviet officials, or sometimes just Soviet academic, the institute people. So if you could comment on that, and I'll leave it at that, because I realize we're running short of time. So if you can comment on that, because that too, that issue has been, and you discussed this in your book, has been emphasized as shedding light on how things moved along under Reagan. So if you can comment.
Yeah, so this really plugs into the bigger argument in the book about quiet diplomacy, and that's Reagan's term for it. And it included, for example, the hush-hush meetings to solve the Pentecostalists issue, and then the fact that the United States committed itself to, and I'm quoting Reagan, no crowing. And it also was about episodes like the meetings between Burns and Kochemasov, and then Kochemasov's successor Abrasimov in Berlin, or Max Kampelman with some of his Soviet counterparts at the Madrid talks ongoing throughout this period. And then there are just these episodes of more private individuals, right, who are traveling in the United States. There's a great episode, for example, with what I believe it's Chernayev terms a distinguished tourist, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who takes a vacation in Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula in 1985, and gives the Soviets a rundown, a very negative rundown, in fact, on his sense of the prospects for US-Soviet relations going forward. So in the book, I suggest that these contacts had positive effects for the relationship overall. They were a chance to, in some sense, kind of dispel the myths about one another and humanize one another, oftentimes in particular contexts about a specific event where there was kind of a negative reaction. And also just to discover the extent to which they were often speaking the same language. So the case that strikes me the most are the conversations about the kind of nuclear responsibility, which is very much on the mind of both Andropov and Reagan. Reagan has a real fear of Armageddon, and I use the term Armageddon advisedly, right? He viewed this in a very biblical sense. And Andropov too talks a lot about the dangers of nuclear wars that no one wants because of misperception, miscalculation, and misconstruing what's really kind of posturing for real demonstrations of intent. And it's through some of these conversations that I think via intermediaries, US and Soviet leaders and policymakers as a whole recognize that they actually share some of not only the same goals, but also some of the same anxieties. And I think that has a positive consequences for US-Soviet relations as a whole. But of course, that's only part of the picture. And certainly the more overt engagement between Reagan and Gorbachev, which kicks off in November kind is also really critical to this process. The more covert type is emboldening, is kind of proof of concept, if you will, and is, I think, as the book shows, beneficial to the course of the superpower relationship.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Whoops, hang on. Thank you, Simon. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. There are a couple of questions about SDI, but I will suggest to people that the Strategic Defense Initiative, the ballistic missile defense program that President Reagan initiated in 1983, which basically expanded or focused some programs that had long been underway. But so let me suggest to people, the book is, again, wonderfully concise. It really gives you something you can read and be able to digest and to take things away from in a single day, which is hard to say about quite a few turgid academic works. Fortunately, Simon's very readable and very interesting book does keep readers wanting to actually read it instead of struggling through it. It is also very reasonably priced from Cornell University Press. The one thing I wish Cornell University Press had done was to use footnotes instead of endnotes, which most scholars would prefer to have, or at least people who want to look at some of the archival materials you've used would prefer. But again, the endnotes at least have the page numbers at the top of the page, so you can figure out fairly easily. It's not the endnotes that exist in some commercial publishers where they're basically unusable. But aside from that, though, it is easily available from Amazon.com or directly from Cornell University Press, and I would encourage people to get a hold of it, and we will continue the discussion about it. So thank you very much, Simon, and to others who have raised questions. And with that, we will sign off for today. I believe this is the final seminar of this semester, and we will pick up seminars on the 2nd of February of next year, Groundhog Day of next year. So, all right, thank you again, Simon.